I never imagined that one day I would be writing this. Throughout my entire life, I believed that my path was clear, that my faith was unshakable, that my mission was to follow God without question. Since I was little, I was taught that obedience and renunciation were the way to holiness, that the outside world was dangerous, and that only within the walls of the convent would I be safe, protected, and close to God. I absorbed this belief with all my being. At 18, when I entered the convent, I felt I was doing something grand, surrendering myself completely to a life of purity and devotion. For over 2 decades, I followed every rule with absolute fervor. Silence was my prayer, fasting was my purification, and blind obedience was my greatest virtue. But then, everything changed. There was no grand event, no sign from the heavens, no divine voice telling me to open my eyes. It was something much subtler and, at the same time, devastating. It all began with a simple verse, a single verse that destroyed the foundations of my institutionalized faith and launched me into a whirlwind of doubts that I could no longer ignore. It was an ordinary day. I was in the convent library, surrounded by the scent of old pages, the gentle murmur of other sisters leafing through books, and the distant sound of bells marking the hours. I picked up the Bible for yet another devotional reading, seeking comfort in the Scriptures, as I always did. My eyes rested on Isaiah 46:7, and I read it, without much attention at first. But something in those words made me stop. I reread, again and again. They carry him on their shoulders and bear him. They place him in a dwelling and he remains there. He cannot move from his place. Even if someone calls to him, he does not answer. He cannot save him from his troubles. A shiver ran down my spine. Why did those words seem to scream at me? Why did they disturb me so much? It was as if a silent whisper inside me was trying to show me something I refused to see. For years I passed by the sacred images in the convent, kneeling before them, praying to them, seeking intercession. But at that moment, a question struck me forcefully. Was I placing my faith in something that could not hear me? I tried to push the thought away. It wasn't the first time I encountered verses that were difficult to interpret. Since I entered the convent, I was taught that the Bible was not to be read in isolation, but understood in the light of the Church's traditions. Interpretation was left to those who had spiritual authority over us. I was simply supposed to trust. But this time, something was different. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the verse kept echoing in my mind. I began to observe everything around me with a look I had never had before. The images, the rituals, the candles, the processions. The more I reflected, the more I felt an unnamed discomfort. I remember walking through the convent that night, feeling the weight of doubt, like a stone in my chest. What if we were clinging to something that God never asked for? What if we were placing our faith in symbols instead of in the Creator himself? These questions were dangerous. I knew what happened to those who questioned, but for the first time, I couldn't silence them. A restlessness began to grow inside me, consuming me in a way I had never experienced before. At first, I tried to resolve it in the only way I knew how, with more prayer, more fasting, more discipline. I spent sleepless nights kneeling on the cold floor of my room, asking God to take those doubts from my heart. But no matter how much I prayed, the discomfort only grew. I started noticing details that before seemed normal. Why were some sisters treated so harshly while others received privileges? Why was the imposed silence so absolute, as if even our thoughts needed to be policed? They always told me that the convent was a haven of peace, but for the first time, I began to see it as a prison. The fear of questioning was so great that I found myself suppressing my own thoughts, afraid that somehow someone might find out. The worst part was having no one to talk to about it. If I mentioned my doubts to the other sisters, they might denounce me. The idea of being seen as a traitor was terrifying. So, I just pretended. I continued following the rules, reciting the prayers, participating in the rituals. But inside, something was broken. Outwardly, I was still the same. a disciplined nun, fulfilling my duties flawlessly, maintaining an unquestionable posture of devotion. But inside, everything was falling apart. I began to seek answers in secret. During the rare opportunities we had to access religious books beyond the assigned readings, I started studying the Bible with a different perspective. I went straight to the words of Jesus, without intermediaries, without filters imposed by the institution. And it was then that something began to become clear to me. Many of the traditions we followed so reverently did not seem to have been taught by him. Where in the Bible was the need to isolate oneself from the world? Where did Jesus command that faith require mediators between God and his children? Each new question made me feel as if the ground were crumbling beneath my feet. I wanted to believe that it was all just a phase, that soon I would find a comforting answer, something that would allow me to move forward in peace. But the truth was that I already knew. I could no longer believe blindly. And that terrified me, because if I no longer belonged to the convent, then where did I belong? My anguish grew with each passing day. At first I thought I could live with it, that perhaps it was possible to carry my doubts in silence without anyone noticing. But their weight was unbearable. I tried to concentrate on the daily tasks, the work in the garden, the preparation of meals, the chants in the chapel, but in everything I saw contradictions. I began to feel disconnected, as if I no longer belonged to that world. Every Mass seemed like a rehearsed play. Every repeated prayer sounded empty. What once filled me now suffocated me. And then, fear began to take hold of me in a different way. It was no longer just the fear of questioning, but the fear of what would happen if someone noticed. I had already heard stories about sisters who dared to doubt and were silenced in ways that were never explained. Some were sent to other convents suddenly. Others simply disappeared, and we never heard from them again. The thought that I could be next robbed me of sleep. I needed to leave. I had to find a way to escape that place. But how? Where would I go? I knew nothing beyond those walls. The idea of fleeing was absurd. Where would I go? The outside world was completely unknown to me. I had no money, no documents, no one to help me. Moreover, if they discovered I planned to leave, they could prevent my escape in ways I couldn't even imagine. But, on the other hand, staying meant living imprisoned within a structure that no longer made sense to me. I was being consumed by fear and uncertainty. I spent weeks weighing the risks, trying to find an exit that wouldn't put me in danger. Then, one night, while looking out the small window of my room, I saw something that made me decide. Outside the convent, there was a garden where we used to work. Further ahead, there was the back gate, which was only opened for occasional deliveries. It was a risky path, but it was the only option. If I wanted to escape, I would have to act quickly and alone. I spent days observing the schedules, noting the moments when the convent was quietest. I needed a moment of carelessness, a second when no one was watching. The idea of failing and being discovered terrified me, but the fear of staying there was even greater. The day finally arrived. My heart was beating so hard that I feared someone might hear it. I waited until the quietest hour of the night, when the other sisters were already asleep and the night watch had not yet begun. I took only the essentials, a small bag with some clothes, a piece of bread, and a rosary that, ironically, I no longer knew if I wanted to carry. I walked through the dark corridors with light steps, holding my breath at every slightest noise. When I reached the door that led to the garden, my body trembled so much that I had to hold onto the wall to avoid falling. Forcing the doorknob seemed to take an eternity. Every second stretched out, as if time were testing my determination. When I finally managed to get out, the cold night air hit me like a shock. I ran. I ran without looking back, without thinking, without breathing properly. My only thought was to cross that gate before anyone noticed my absence. When I reached the exit, the latch gave way with a low click, and then, suddenly, I was outside. The silence of the night was deafening. For the first time in decades, I was free. But where would I go? Now? The first thing I felt upon stepping outside the convent was a crushing emptiness. For years, that place was all I knew. Now, I was on the outside, and I had no idea what to do next. My instinct was to run, to get as far away as possible before anyone noticed my escape. But run to where? The road ahead was long and dark, illuminated only by a pale moonlight. My hands were cold, my heart still pounding in my chest, and I felt an irrational terror of being pulled back. For a moment I turned, to look at the convent one last time. Those stone walls, which once gave me security, now looked like a tomb from which I had escaped. I took a deep breath and moved on. After years of living in absolute obedience, every step I took felt like an act of rebellion. My mind was torn between fear and a strange euphoria. I had done the unthinkable, but at the same time, one question haunted me. Had I made a mistake? Would God see me as a sinner for having fled? The night advanced, and the cold began to seep into my bones. I wandered aimlessly, with no money, with no idea how to survive. My stomach growled, and fatigue began to weigh me down. The initial adrenaline of the escape was dissipating, and the reality of my situation was becoming clearer. I could not go back, but I also did not know how to move forward. Then I saw a small church in the distance, its doors ajar as if calling to me. I approached hesitantly, unsure if I should enter. But what else could I do? My feet moved on their own, and soon I was inside, surrounded by the familiar scent of incense and old wood. At the back of the church, an elderly woman was lighting candles at the altar. She looked at me with curiosity, but without judgment. My face must have been pale, my eyes lost. Before I could say anything, she simply smiled and pointed to a pew. Without the strength to resist, I sat down and let the tears I had held back for so long finally fall. I wept in silence for a long time, feeling the weight of everything I had left behind. It wasn't just the convent, the rules, or the routine. It was the feeling of being completely alone in the world. I had never made decisions on my own. There had always been someone telling me what to do, when to pray, what to eat, what to wear. Now I was free, but that freedom frightened me. The elderly woman who had received me continued her tasks without pressuring me, respecting my space. When I finally lifted my face, she simply sat beside me and, in a gentle voice, said something I have never forgotten. Faith is not about where you are, but about whom you trust. Her words kept echoing in my mind. For so long, I had associated my devotion with the walls of the convent, with the rules I followed so zealously. But what if true faith wasn't there? What if God had never asked me to live that way? For the first time, I considered the possibility that my leaving was not a mistake, but a call to something greater. The woman offered me a hot tea and asked me my name. For a second, I hesitated. My name was all that remained of the life I knew. But when I said it out loud, something inside me seemed to solidify. Maria. I was still me. I was still a daughter of God, still had value, even outside the convent's rules. The elderly woman listened to my story with patience, without interrupting me, without expressing shock or disapproval. When I finished, I felt a weight lift from my chest. I expected judgment. I expected to be questioned. But instead, she simply smiled and said, "You are not the first, and you will not be the last." There was something reassuring in those words. That night, I slept in the church, feeling for the first time in a long while a strange kind of peace. I still didn't have all the answers, but I knew I was on the right path. I wasn't running from God. I was running toward Him, without intermediaries, without barriers, without fear. The following days were a blur of uncertainty and adaptation. The elderly woman, whose name was Helena, helped me in the only way she could, offering temporary shelter and some basic guidance about the world I did not know. It was only then that I realized how unprepared I was for life outside the convent. Simple things like catching a bus, using money, or even choosing what to eat were enormous challenges for me. My world had always been regulated by fixed rules, determined schedules, and a routine that never changed. Now, I had choices, and that paralyzed me. Every little decision felt like a test. My heart oscillated between relief at being free and fear of the unknown. But one thing was certain. I couldn't stay there forever. I needed to find a purpose, a new path. The problem was that I didn't know where to start. It was then that I heard for the first time about other people like me, ex-nuns, ex-priests, people who had questioned their beliefs and needed to start over. The idea of not being alone gave me strength. If they had found a way, perhaps I could find mine too. Over time, I began to reconnect with something I had forgotten, my own voice. I had spent years listening only to orders and doctrines, but now it was different. My faith had not disappeared. It had only changed. I was no longer seeking ready-made answers, but I wanted to discover God for myself, without imposed filters. It was then that I began to share my story. At first, only with a few people. Then, in small support groups for those who had also left religious orders. And then, something unexpected happened. My story began to spread. People sought me out, wanting to understand how I had had the courage to leave. Some wanted advice, others just needed to hear that they weren't crazy for questioning. And the more I spoke, the more I realized that my purpose might be right there, helping others find their own truth, just as I was trying to find mine. But this exposure also brought problems. Not everyone viewed my journey with favor. Some people accused me of betrayal, said that I was lost, that my destiny would be hell. Others sent threats, trying to silence me. But I could no longer turn back. The threats became more frequent. Some came from strangers on the internet. Others seemed much closer than I would have liked to admit. I received anonymous messages saying that I should stop before it was too late. Some ex-colleagues from the convent got in touch, begging me to come back, warning that I was making a fatal mistake. But with each attempt to silence me, my conviction grew stronger. I knew I wasn't alone. More and more people who had gone through the same process of questioning sought me out, looking for support, trying to understand what it meant to live a faith without the chains of imposed tradition. Deep down, I still felt fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of the consequences, fear of the unknown. But something inside me screamed that moving forward was the only option. I could no longer hide. Today, I still don't have all the answers. I still struggle against the shadows of the past and the weight of guilt that sometimes tries to pull me back. But there is something I have never lost since the day I crossed those gates. The freedom to seek the truth for myself. I don't know what the future holds, or how far my story will go. I only know that I can no longer live a faith based on fear. God is not in stone walls, nor in rules created by men. He is where there is love, where there is truth, where there is courage to question. And if my journey has taught me anything, it is this. True faith does not imprison, it liberates. And it is in that freedom that I have chosen to live.